I've never really talked about, my transition to where I'm at now, but just so you know, I mean, I was a little nationalist. All of my parents are moderate Democrats. All my uncles are pretty right-wing, ex-military, gun-toting, Republican voting. And I grew up, I was in first grade when the first Gulf War happened, and I remember watching it on TV and just thinking it was so awesome and cool, and America, America, we're the best. I mean, just rooting for us, watching the little blips on the screen. I didn't see the highway of death or any of that because that didn't make it to the nightly news, at least the early broadcasts that I would have watched. And just growing up, I mean, hey, John Wayne movies, Clint Eastwood movies, The Dirty Dozen, The Devil's Brigade. I was a Boy Scout, but there's nothing wrong with Boy Scouts, but like, country, and I did Memorial Day every year. I was in the Memorial Day parade, raising the flags, lowering the flags every year for almost 10 years. First in Boy Scouts, and then in marching band, and actually for a while I did both. I changed and marched in the parade, and then changed into my uniform and raise the flag and lower the flag and play taps and all that good stuff. And I was in the Civil War Roundtable where all the people in it were veterans, mostly Korean veterans, but close enough. One of the very first books I read, I didn't read much as a kid. I was a TV person. When I watched the History Channel, I remember the very first thing, I got to stay up late. I used to have a bedtime at 8:30, and I remember there was a show and it was on D-Day, and I said, "Oh, can I please watch this?" And, my parents, seeing it was about D-Day, of course. And so I've probably seen every show that there is on the topic, and then, no, not literally, but many, many, many. One of the very first books I read was Citizen Soldiers by Stephen Ambrose. And this whole, I remember in fourth grade, they had a map of the world about World War II, and I just, in my conception, it was the United States versus Japan and Germany, and it was 1 against 2. This is the impression you get. It was just us, and we were outnumbered, and by our greatness, we smote our enemies. That's the impression I had. That's the way I looked at it. And of course, I've learned more. Obviously, the United States wasn't the only country. Obviously, the United States' role in World War II is extremely important. It's a big deal. But in some of the most important areas, the United States was an ancillary character. This is most especially true on the Eastern Front between Germany and USSR, where practically no American forces took direct part. Now, the Russians received enormous aid from the United States, and Manstein over there actually talks about later in the war the logistic capabilities of the Russians became far more than they had ever been, thanks to a huge number of American trucks and American tanks and American planes. He didn't specify those other ones, but that's there if you look for it. Not to mention that the entire Soviet industrial base is a bad copy of the American industrial base. That's a whole other video, which I already did, by the way. I think all this is to say that, unlike World War I, where the American people had a bad taste and drew the correct lessons from the war, this time they drew the wrong lessons. And one is that it was worth it and that it was good. And I think part of this is because of the evil of Nazi Germany. And, okay, yeah, the evil of Japan too. But this, of course, ignores the evil of everybody else, including us. The firebombing of all those cities and the internment of the Japanese, the conscription of all those soldiers. All that stuff is actually evil too. You might say it's less evil, sure. Of course, what the Soviets did is not less evil. What Chiang and the Communists did is also not less evil. The other thing is that now there's this, the lessons of Munich. They say, we should have fought Hitler earlier. So now this is I guess that's a debatable thing. There might be some argument that sometimes preemption makes sense, but the way it has in effect been played out is that now preemption is always justified, which is not the same thing. You know, Saddam Hussein, no matter what, was never going to be another Hitler. And Germany was never going to win that war, and nobody today is a Germany. Well, no, Russia and China are more powerful than Germany, but we're not going to go to war with them. I sure hope so, anyway. The government got enormous more credibility than it did before, and part of it is we have this whole population of old people now. It's getting smaller every day, but who it gets personal. You know, if some old person watches this, and they were in World War II, there's a very strong possibility, they won't all do this because I know, I bet some of them, that they're going to take it personal, like I'm spitting on them or whatever. Look, if you were conscripted, you didn't have a choice, you know, and that actually robs what you did of any moral character. If you're coerced into doing something, then you can't really be held accountable, at least to the same standard. And even the people who volunteered, they volunteered under duress. Nobody who volunteered, can we say for sure, would have done so if there hadn't been a draft. I'm sure some of them would have, but there's no way to tell if that person or that person would have. Save the people who volunteered before the draft was enacted, which was before the war started, by the way. You know, we have all these old people, and we're supposed to venerate our elders, and it's taken as an affront to them to speak in these terms, even though many of them were scarred in such amazingly horrible ways. I recommend Eugene Sledge, the guy who's in Pacific, who wrote the book with the old breed. He actually gave a lecture at the Mises Institute, because I guess he was a professor at Auburn for a long time, about the cost. I think it's called The Cost of War. I'm not going to find a link for it. It's a great lecture. Nothing I hadn't heard before, but just that, you know, it's so horrible. It's the most horrible thing that there can be, and to just take that lightly and wrap it in a flag as this, like a parade, basically, is a travesty. It's horrible. And you know, my mom's father, the father of all my right-wing uncles, he was in World War II. He was in the Philippines, and during Vietnam, he went and his sons were old enough to be in Vietnam, and he told them straight up, if I think any of you are going to be drafted, we're moving to Canada. They lived in Detroit when it had been that far for them to go. So they're all patriotic, and he never, as far as I know, was never any kind of anti-war protester or anything like that. He volunteered right after Pearl Harbor, just like 2 million other people, but he wasn't going to have his sons go to war, a war that would have been less intense than the one he was in. So, and I'm not saying that they all have that attitude, but this, I don't know, it's really bad, because this patriotism, in an abstract way, is not necessarily bad, but in practically, it almost always comes to deference and respect for the government, not necessarily the country. The saying, I think, that expresses this is, you know, you can say, I love my country, but I hate my government. This whole World War II thing blurs, war in general will do this, but blurs this to the point where it's a meaningless distinction, and loving your country means loving your government, and serving your government. I hate it when people say that, you serve this country. No, you work for the government. There's a big difference. If I provide things that people want, and they voluntarily pay for it, it's a service. If something is taxed, then it is not a service, because only one party is consenting, and the other party is being taxed. They're not consenting, so it's not a service. Sorry. Hate that. That's part of the legacy, though. And of course, there's this whole empire thing. The United States had done imperial things before, there's no question. Most systematically with the Native Americans, although that is a whole other topic, and I'm not one of those who characterize it always that way. But there's the Spanish-American War, but nothing like this. I mean, like I said, after World War II, the British and the French empires basically collapsed, but we tried to pay for them, and we tried to prop them up, and we got in some hellholes because of that. And we're still dealing with Vietnam. We're not still dealing with, but Iran we are. We tried to help the British Petroleum there, and look what happened. And then all these Arab states and Iraq and all that stuff. Israel. I mean, Americans thought the war ended, but the American government never brought all the troops home ever. And the big war ended, but then the Cold War started, and little hot wars here and there. And it's like whenever our government does anything now, there's this shadow that it's just like the good fight against Hitler, even though there's no connection with what it does now with what it was doing then, even if what it was doing then is justified. And it's just this huge part of the social consciousness, because there's so many movies and it's referenced so much, and there's so many books. I mean, if you watch the History Channel, 95% of the History Channel covers less than 1% of history. There's going to be 100 shows on D-Day before you see even one that covers anything about World War I. Even though World War I is, next to World War II, the most significant thing, But D-Day, that's the other thing, D-Day. What about all the shows about Stalingrad? There's some about Stalingrad, but you'd think that the war happened in France only. And that was just, and Iwo Jima and all. It's just an endless parade of jingoism and chauvinism and vicariousness. I don't understand this. Even assuming that the soldiers did brave things and whatever, that's not you. You didn't do those things, so it doesn't mean anything to you when that stuff happened. All right, I wish it's the same with sports. It's like rooting for a sports team. Only these are sports teams that kill people. So slave armies that kill people because they were forced to join. So the legacy is absolutely catastrophic, and I think the main one is ideological. I think it's made people trust the government more, and it's made people accept more government than ever before, and it's given a talking point. I mean, Michael Moore says that World War II justifies socialism. The most right-wing Tea Partier in the country is just going to shut his mouth, and he has nothing to say back. He's not going to be able to say, well, actually, World War II was a horrible disaster. It was the worst thing that ever happened. No Tea Partier is ever going to say that to Michael Moore. He's just going to have to hang his head and make some inconsistent argument about how big government is bad now with Obama, but big government with FDR, well, that was just the bee's knees. And I'm not just condemning World War II because it's a good talking point when arguing leftists. It's because it is condemnable. And so that's why I think it's so important. That's why I bothered making a whole bunch of videos about it. And although not that many people will watch them, it's why it's really important to understand how destructive it was, how unnecessary it was, and how much we should revile it and those who made it happen. And of course, one man above all stands out there, and that's of course FDR. He died a horrible, slow death, and I only wish he had lived long enough to be unelected and lose in an election and suffer even that much more. I consider him the worst American in history, worse than Lincoln, worse than Roosevelt, or worse than Wilson, far worse than Bush or Obama, the most deceitful liar. I mean, there's been some good liars. Bill Clinton is an amazing liar. He's almost convinced me before. FDR, take them all to school. When he died, when MacArthur found out, he said, so the old man has died. He would never tell the truth when a lie would do, which was always. He's scum, and he needs to be taken from his pedestal of demigodery, and he needs to be cast straight to hell. And I'm not religious, but that's just where he belongs.